I want to share with you an experience of teaching the impossible and what I learned from it. My primary advisor in the PhD program is Dr. Nikki Kasumi Clements, a scholar of ethics, late Christian antiquity, and one of the finest scholars of the French historian of ideas, Michel Foucault. It makes sense my dissertation will be examining the philosophies that undergird spiritual care practices. The second reader of my dissertation is Professor Jeffrey Kripal. Perhaps you're familiar with Jeff's work. He specializes in the history of American metaphysical religion. He wrote the authoritative history of the Esalen Institute in California. As he states in his own words, he describes his work now. He says, "I now hold a philosophy of mind very similar to that which Plotinus apparently held, one that sees the body-brain as a filter or transmitter of consciousness instead of a producer. I've been interested especially in how these same currents were picked up and transformed by various early Jewish and Christian communities with their emphasis on innate and immediate gnosis, or mystical knowledge, and transmitted to us today through the long and complex histories of things such as Hermeticism, Western esotericism, Christian heresy, mesmerism, spiritualism, modern occultism, and most recently, metaphysical movements and paranormal currents like the human potential movement." In 2010, Jeff wrote an intellectual history of the impossible he titled Authors of the Impossible. In this book, he focused on four thinkers: Charles Fort, Frederick Myers, Jacques Vallée, and Bertrand Mehoust. And in this book, he explores the history of psychical phenomenon and argues that it offers valuable insights into the sacred. Kripal critiques the dismissal of paranormal research as pseudoscience and highlights its significance in understanding human consciousness and spirituality. As he says, this conceptual matrix of the paranormal, it turns out, was not born in the tabloids, wasn't born in science fiction novels, but was born in some of the most accomplished scientific personalities and elite academic institutions of the European and American academies, in figures like Alfred Russel Wallace, co-founder of evolution with Darwin, and around institutions like Cambridge, Harvard, particularly William James, and a bit later Duke University around the botanist J.B. Rhine. By an author of the impossible, I meant something specific and radical. I meant an author who writes about well-documented historical events and common human experiences that are not supposed to happen, but they do. And who, by writing about these impossible things in an especially powerful way, renders them plausible, imaginable, thinkable, in a word, real. After Authors of the Impossible appeared in 2010, he continued to work in these twilight zones. And sometimes, Kripal tells, in the early winter of 2014, he was with Jacques Vallée in Berkeley, California. If you're not familiar with Jacques Vallée, anybody seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind? So François Truffaut, who plays the French scientist, that's Jacques Vallée, actually. He's an amazing, amazing human being. So Jacques was beginning to worry about his research and correspondence files, Kripal says, and he wanted to know if any of them, if I had any suggestions about a university that would preserve them. He was concerned about these historical items being lost, discarded, or almost as bad, sold on the rare book market. As he is easily the most admired writer on the subject, his personal papers could fetch a pretty penny. He was not looking for money, though. He was looking for UFO future researchers who would take the UFO phenomenon seriously. In 2016, Vallée visited Rice and agreed to a major gift of his work. And then came the collections of Whitley Strieber, Ed May, and Dr. John Mack. You probably have heard of Whitley Strieber. He's a horror novelist. He wrote a book called The Wolfen, but particularly wrote one of the most widely read accounts of alien abduction, the 1987 book communion. And if you're familiar with communion, the original cover has the almond-eyed alien, what often called the Greys. And after that, Whitley and his wife Anne started receiving thousands of letters, basically people saying thank you, because this is exactly what I saw. And I'm getting kind of goosebumps thinking about this, because the collection at Rice has thousands of these communion letters, and I've held one in my hands. Many of them are actually not written letters, but they're drawings of people's alien encounters. Ed May was the physicist that led the US government's remote viewing program. It was called Project Stargate. Yes, the US government spent millions of dollars training and employing psychical gifted military personnel to clairvoyantly spy on the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Most recently have come the papers of Harvard psychiatrist John Mack, one of the first psychiatrists to take seriously people's alien encounter experiences as just that, serious encounters and not some psychic break with reality. At present, Kripal estimates that the total archival collection at Rice, it's called the Archives of the Impossible, and you can look at it online, stands somewhere north of 100,000 items. When it's all finished, it will easily constitute one of the largest collections of its kind in the world, and almost certainly the largest at an American research university. So, why am I starting a message with what is basically an advertisement for the archives? This is the first story. Because I am a true believer. Now, in what? Am I saying that I am a believer in little green men from Mars? Oh, no. I think the truth is much more interesting. And I tend to think we ask too little from the truth, that we ask truth to take us to fact and not much farther beyond, or that we think of facts as these little atomistic nuggets of information of telling us what it is, and don't imagine that there could be such a thing as a wild fact. I want to think through and reflect on what happens when knowledge fails us. Folks in the UFO or UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomenon, field talk about this failure of knowledge, they talk about it as ontological shock. Now, many of us experience in the course of our lives many times what we would call epistemological shock, that shock of having our knowledge base blown up. What experiencers talk about is beyond epistemological shock, of like having your mind blown, and really talking about having reality blown up. More than just having our knowledge base blown apart, ontological shock is what happens when you have your reality blown apart. So I chuckled a little bit when I drove in and saw the sign that you all are a reality-based religion. I appreciate that you welcome critique from your messages as well. I want to set aside the story of the archives and work my way through another story. While I've been working my way through the PhD adventure, I've also been teaching part-time at the Post Oak High School. 2 of my 3 children are graduates of the high school. I have been involved with Post Oak since 2014 when my oldest enrolled. It's also an international baccalaureate school. It's a Montessori school, if I didn't mention that. And it's also an international baccalaureate school, which means that every student in the junior and senior years takes a 2-year sequence of a class that is called Theory of Knowledge, or TOK. The International Baccalaureate curriculum is decades old. I was an IB student in the 1980s in my public school in Wisconsin. Now, there are a variety of classes you can take in your certain understood areas. To complete the social science track, you could take global politics or economics, or there's even a world religion IB class. For math, there's a more rigorous sequence, there's a less rigorous sequence. In the sciences, you could come through biology or chemistry or physics. But everyone, if you're seeking the diploma, has to do theory of knowledge. And rare it is that you will find an IB alum that has a neutral opinion of their TOK experience. Seriously, students either love it or they hate it. So what is this course, and why am I sharing in this second story? This course is an experience in what we call second-order knowledge. Now, most academic classes focus on first-order knowledge, what you know. What date was the Declaration of Independence signed? What are Buddhism's Four Noble Truths? What is Avogadro's number? Second-order knowledge focuses on how you know what you know. So the course, just quote the TOK curriculum, encourages students to reflect on the central question, how do we know that? Exposes students to ambiguity, uncertainty, and questions with multiple answers. Equips students to effectively navigate and make sense of the world. Okay, you get the point. Very high and lofty goals of creating these ethical and open-minded thinkers. Let me start to put the pieces together and begin with the question that haunts me: what happens when knowledge fails us? The first time that I taught theory of knowledge full-time was my first year in the PhD program at Rice. And I taught the course as best as I could, with how I understood the class and its purpose. And that approach, even with all of its flowery rhetoric, the course is still based in Western epistemological assumptions about what knowledge is. It still categorizes knowledge into areas: history, natural sciences, human sciences, arts, and math. It still uses concepts such as evidence, certainty, truth, explanation, and objectivity. Here in our post-Enlightenment world, even when we speak about wonder or imagination or critical thinking, I would pose it's still within certain parameters of commonly accepted rules and categories. We still play by the rules of reason. But what happens when reason doesn't work? At the same time I was teaching this class, I took an independent study in the fall semester, my first semester at Rice, called New Currents in the Study of Religion and the Impossible, and then a spring semester class based on Jeff's book called Mutants and Mystics. So while I'm guiding high school juniors through this class about interrogating sources of knowledge through concepts such as evidence, explanation, certainty, and objectivity in nicely organized themes in these nicely organized areas of knowledge, I'm reading about witchcraft in the Middle Ages, divine and demonic possession in medieval thought, cryptids, aliens, and the superhuman. What happens when knowledge fails us? While the students were working on their final project for junior year, I decided to quickly develop a final unit called When Knowledge Fails Us, or Knowing the Impossible. So near the end, for 2 classes, we watched the 2020 documentary called The Aerial Phenomenon. This documentary follows a 1994 UFO sighting at the Aerial School outside of Rua, Zimbabwe. 62 students at the aerial school between the ages of 6 and 12 said they saw silver craft descend from the sky and land near the school. Some said they saw one or more creatures approach them and communicate telepathically with them. The documentary follows the story through the eyes of Tim Leach, a BBC correspondent who investigated the event, interviews with many of the students, the investigation of Harvard psychiatrist John Mack, he almost lost his job at Harvard because of it, and Emily Trim, a student at the time who returns to the school as she tries to make sense of her childhood experience. Emily died in November 2024 at the age of 38. When I learned of her death, it was like I lost a friend. I'd watched the documentary countless times. The aerial school incident is considered one of the most important and impactful UFO sightings from the 1990s. And so, as these students, my students, are working through an end of the semester project discussing how knowledge is transmitted, we're watching a documentary about children talking about how a non-human intelligence was telepathically warning them about the dangers of environmental destruction. Okay, a few thoughts. The first question is, how much does culture shape what we see? Literally, what we see. One of my favorite scenes in the documentary is when Emily goes to visit with a local shaman of one of the indigenous tribes who, when told about the event, was totally unfazed. Like, yeah, that's a standard Tuesday for us. The tribal leaders noted that the visitors were attracted to the burial grounds, the aliens, to the burial grounds between their land and the school. African Americans have often spoke of their own double consciousness. Stephen Finley, a professor at LSU, has argued that the Nation of Islam is basically a UFO cult. And what do we make of Native traditions who often speak of themselves as star people? Second question, how much does culture shape what's possible? Charles Fort is one of the most interesting characters. Born in 1874 and died in 1932, Fort spent 30 years visiting libraries in New York City and London, reading scientific journals, newspapers, and magazines, collecting notes on anomalous phenomenon. What Fort basically proved was that this anomalous phenomenon occurs all the time. We're just trained to look right over it as anomalous phenomenon. It's actually reported and recorded in reputable sources of information, and there are patterns and frequencies, yet what I would claim, and Fort would claim, is that we are trained to ignore them or to categorize them as coincidences or figments of the imagination or some sort of delusion. We will never talk about them as wild facts. John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist, says, what's possible is a matter of worldview. A culture decides what's real. Finally, what happens when knowledge fails us? After we watch the documentary, we talk about what we think happened, what we think can happen, what we think did happen. A friend who worked with Dr. Mack, the director of his archives, Karen Austin, comes in and shares her abduction experience. I've had faculty come in and share their paranormal experiences on a voluntary basis. It's really interesting how many people have stories when you give them the permission to tell them. The students are overall respectful, and I sometimes need to encourage them to call BS if they want to. They often give the, it could be possible response in the open mind, but kind of in the laziest of open-minded ways. As in, well, it could have happened. Or when asked, do you think this happened, they reply, I believe that you believe that it happened. Which doesn't feel like an answer at all. I try to push through these lazy answers into investigating that the open-mindedness of TOK seeks to engender is in itself a worldview with limits. Sigmund Freud talked about the three blows to the human ego. The first was the discovery of the heliocentric solar system, proving man was not at the center of the universe. The second was the discovery of evolution. Humanity wasn't even at the center of the created order. And the third, of course, was Freud's theory of the subconscious. We're not even in control of our own selves on a day-to-day basis. What blow would it be to know that we weren't alone in the universe? Such are the reasons that the movies such as Project Hail Mary, coming out in March, and Disclosure Day is coming out in June of this year. Look, in the end, this is not a talk about space aliens, though you cannot have UFOH without UFO. I don't care if you believe any of this or not. But I've shared these stories with you to reflect, as we heard many times this morning, the centrality of reason, that reason perhaps isn't all that there is. And I know it's a word near and dear in the UU tradition. Let me close with a final set of reflections from two of the students, and then the final words of the documentary that come from the war correspondent, Tim Leach. Student number one. We're just an interesting part of the local community, like we go to safari in Africa or see this other creature that is unique to that world. For some people, it is scary, very scary, because it kind of makes them feel humanity is not in complete control of our destinies. And we think we are the dominant species on the planet. But maybe we are the dominant species on the planet, but maybe not the dominant species in this corner of the universe. I think it's certainly open-minded. I think it's a bit arrogant to say that we are the only life in the galaxy or the universe. Second student, I don't think that I'm going to find an answer from Googling it or from talking to others about it. I think it's a long story is the answer. I think the answer will come maybe in this lifetime, maybe in the next. I don't know. And then finally from Tim Leach, the war correspondent who covered the original experience in 1994. I'm glad I was there. It really stretched my mind and gave me a new perspective on life, the universe, and everything really. I would not have missed it for the world. That's all I can say. Thank you.